Okay, so today we are going to discuss the second part on our topic about confounding variables. I would just like to open this lesson with this question. Is it possible to still have confounding variables even when group characteristics are already equal? Remember, the previous lesson we discussed that confounding variables more likely to happen when there are certain characteristics in your participants that are not the same with each other. Kaya nga 'di ba yung panlaban natin sa confounding variable is we need to equalize certain attributes of our participants or certain conditions of our participants so that later on when we get the results we will not be confused on how we interpret the result. Is it the IV causing the changes in our DV or is it some other confounding variables? What do we need to do? We need to equalize group characteristics. Now, let's say for example, we were able to do that. Everything is equal. Na-control mo yung mga necessary control variables. Lahat ng conditions, lahat ng levels in the participants were the same except of course of the manipulation that you're going to do. Okay, let's say everything is equal. Is it still possible to have confounding variables? The answer is yes. Even if everything is equal, lahat ng control variable na control mo, lahat ng posibleng extraneous variables na control mo across different conditions, pwede pa rin magkaroon ng confounding variable because confounding variables can also come from the environment itself where you are doing the experiment. It could be a noise from outside, it could be other distractions, it could be temperature, it could be the lighting of the room, pwede pa rin. So the thing is, ang gusto ko lang i-establish dito is confounding variables does not only come from the participants, but it can also come from the physical environment where you are doing the experiment. And I think, in a way, na-discuss na rin natin ito in the live lecture. That's the reason why it's very important for us to use laboratories. Because laboratories will help us control those extraneous variables that may be caused by the environment where we are in. So again, kapag wala ka kasi sa laboratory, no, these extraneous variables when you perform the experiment can later on become confounding variables. And the laboratory will help us really minimize these extraneous variables or even eliminate extraneous variables so that it will not become confounding variables later when we already have the data. Again, the important idea here is confounding variables can come from the participants kasi meron kang mga attributes na hindi na control. It can come from the environment where you are doing the experiment. Okay? But for today, I would like to focus on confounding variables caused by the experimenter. Alam nyo ba, yung experimenter, pwede rin siyang maging source ng confounding variables later on in the experiments. And there are two kinds. There are two kinds of confounding variables that can be caused by the experimenter. Demand characteristics and experimenter effect. So we are going to discuss how these two can lead to confounding variables in our experiment. So we would like to eliminate these two para mamaya when we already have the data, we will not be confused about what is the cause of our changes in the dependent variable. Okay, so again, let's summarize. Where do confounding variables come from? The participants themselves. Kasi meron kang control variable na hindi mo na-equalize. From the environment where you are doing the experiment. That's why we need laboratories for this. And for today's lesson, we are going to talk about confounding variables that can come from the experimenter. Let us start with this case. You plan to conduct an experiment that explores the role of light intensity on memory. Specifically, you hypothesize that brighter light will make memorizing lists of words more efficient than using a dimmer light. Design how the experiment will run. After assigning the experiment or after designing the experiment, explain to your partner, well, kung meron ka sanang kausap dyan sa bahay mo, no, what part of the experiment can demand characteristics be a problem and what would you do to prevent this? Okay? Because usually, itong slide na ito, ginagawa ito in the live classroom discussion and I pair students to talk about how demand characteristics can affect this kind of experiment. Okay, but anyway, let's continue. How does demand characteristics lead to confounding variable? Okay, so let's convert that case, the one I've shown you a while ago, into a question. Does intensity of light affect memory performance? Diba? Yan yung magiging research question mo eh. And then let's run the experiment. How will it go? IV will be light intensity and I will have two levels, bright light and the dim light. Okay, so level 1 will be that the light will be very bright and level 2 medyo maliwanag lang and our dependent variable would be memory. The performance of one's memory. Ano yung operational definition natin? We will give them a list of words where they are going to memorize those list of words, as many as they can, in a specific amount of time. Alright? So, to avoid any confounding variables later on, anong gagawin natin? We are going to control the variables that needs to be controlled between people in level 1 and level 2. So, kayo nang bahala mag-isip kung ano ba yung mga iba't ibang mga control variables na yan that you need to equalize across the two groups. Okay? Pero, syempre, ang pinaka-obvious na control variable dito would be their memory capacity. Diba? More or less, yung memory capacity ng mga tao in level 1 shall be the same with the memory capacity of people in level 2. So, let's go inside the experiment and see what happens inside the group in level 1. Okay? So, the following will be the steps. So, first, we enter the laboratory as the experimenter and then we introduce to them the experiment. Diba? So, how do we do that? Well, of course, you tell them that this is an experiment on memory and all the other details that they need to know about the experiment. Why are we doing this? Because we are applying the principle of informed consent. Diba? Remember, hindi dapat tumakbo ang experiment that participants don't understand what it is in the first place. So, we apply this principle, the informed consent. After we explain to them what the experiment is about, what's next, we give them a list of words to memorize in 10 minutes. But while they are memorizing this list of words, the light is bright. Okay? Very bright light yung ginagamit nila to memorize this list of words. Next, after that, we are going to give them a test where they will be recalled or they will be asked to recall all the words that they can remember from the list of words that we gave them in the previous step. And they will do this for 5 minutes. As many words as they can. Isulat nila doon sa papel kung ano yung mga words that they remember. And then lastly, of course, we are going to compute the results. Now we measure our dependent variable. Out of those list of words that they memorized for 10 minutes, how many words did they correctly memorize? Now, let's move on to level 2, to the dim light condition. Ang mangyayari dito is, everything is exactly the same. And it should be. Diba? It should be. Dapat naman talaga lahat ng mangyayari in level 2 will be exactly the same as the things that will happen in level 1 except for the light. Only in this level that the light will be dimmer. Okay? So, yun lang yung pagkakaiba ng level 1 sa level 2. Level 1, very bright light. Level 2, very dim light. The rest, exactly the same. Now, let's create some hypothetical results and conclusion. Let's say, after comparing the memory performance between the bright light and the dim light condition, it appeared that there is no difference between memory performance in the bright light condition and the dim light condition. Ibig sabihin, when you run the analysis in statistica, results show na wala naman masyadong pagkakaiba, hindi nalalayo yung number of words being memorized from the list depending on the type of light. There's no significant difference. Your conclusion would be, of course, that brightness of light really does not matter in how many words are you able to memorize. In more technical terms, this means that you were not able to reject your null hypothesis, right? So, hindi mo na-reject yung null hypothesis mo, which means you were not able to show in your experiment that your IV affects your DV. So, technically, in this experiment, your IV has no effect on your dependent variable. But here's the thing. It is possible that light really does affect memory performance. Meron naman talagang epekto yung ilaw, klase ng ilaw, doon sa memory performance. It's just that, in your experiment, it did not appear. Sa Tagalog, hindi lang lumabas yung epekto. Meron naman talagang epekto yung ilaw sa memory performance. But, for some confounding variable in this experiment, that effect did not appear. It looks like this. As you can see, our data is showing that IV does not affect our DV. See? IV, light intensity, DV, memory performance. Guess what? The data is telling us memory performance does not differ between bright light and dim light. But, tignan nyo yung underlying, look at this. Look at the underlying red right here. Ano yung underlying red na yan? That is the effect of the IV on the DV. Meron naman talagang epekto. It's just that the data is showing us or some sort of fooling us to believe that there is no such effect. Why? Because there is this confounding variable that is hiding that effect of our IV on our DV. So, para lumabas yung effect ng IV sa DV, what do we need to do? We need to eliminate that confounding variable. Kapag natanggal natin yung confounding variable na yan, then it would be very clear from our data that IV does affect our dependent variable. So the question now is, what could be that confounding variable that is hiding the effect of our IV on our DV? Here's the confounding variable. It is possible that in our experiment, our participants exerted more effort than they normally would in our experiment. In this case, they exerted more effort in memorizing the list of words compared to how they will do it outside our laboratory. Now, is this bad? Diba? Kasi kung iisipin no, parang ang lumalabas dito, nakasama pa yung pag-exert nila ng more effort. But if you're going to think about it, isn't it that good? Hindi ba maganda na they are exerting more effort in memorizing the list of words? Kasi ibig sabihin nun, sineseryoso nila yung experiment mo? Well, the answer is no, this is not good. Because the rule in experiment is, we would like to capture any behaviors of our subjects inside the laboratory. We would like to capture their normal behavior inside the laboratory. How they behave, how they do things in the outside world, we want to see those things inside the laboratory. We would like to catch their normal mode. We want to capture their outside of the laboratory mode. Diba? Ayaw natin na pinepeke nila. Ayaw natin na, we don't like participants faking their performance inside their laboratory simply because they know that they are being observed. Are you getting my point? We would like their normal behaviors in the outside world to be captured inside the laboratory. So we wouldn't like them to be exerting more or less effort in the laboratory than they normally would in the outside world. Let me demonstrate why. Okay, again. This is what should have happened if they exerted normal effort in the laboratory. Okay? So, ito yung scenario if they exerted normal effort. Look at this. So, we have two levels of our IV, bright light and the dim light condition. Okay? Again, in this scenario, they exerted normal effort. Bright light, normal effort. People in the dim light, normal effort. Now, this should have been the results. Those people in the bright light condition who exerted normal effort in memorizing the list of words, they have a memory performance of 85/100. Let's say 85% accuracy. In the dim light condition, when they exerted normal effort, their memory performance is at 50%. Now, given this set of data, you would easily conclude, we can easily see the effect of the light on the dependent variable. That our memory becomes better when we are using a bright light compared to a dim light. But, this is what actually happened. Diba? Ito talaga yung nangyari. Since they exerted more effort, people in bright light more effort, people in dim light more effort, what happened? It equalized their effort, therefore equalizing their performance in the memory task. So both of the group scored an accuracy of 85%. So anong conclusion mo? Well, your conclusion here would be there are no differences between bright light and dim light condition in terms of how accurate their memory is. So ito na ngayon yung naging conclusion natin. Walang epekto ang IV sa ating dependent variable. So again, what should have happened was nakita sana natin yung difference ng performance between bright light and dim light only if they exerted normal effort, if they did not try harder to memorize those list of words. That was the problem. They exerted more effort. Okay? Yan yung naging problema. Yan yung confounding variable na sinasabi ko. So the lesson that we can learn from this illustration is participants in an experiment must exert normal effort inside the laboratory. We want to capture their normal way of doing things outside the laboratory. That's a very important lesson that you need to remember, especially when you are now designing, when you are now executing your original experiments. So how do we solve this? How do we solve this problem of having more effort? Well, the answer, we need to make sure that in that experiment, they are exerting normal effort by ensuring that anong mangyayari kapag talagang nasigurado mo na normal effort yung ine-exert nila. As you can see here, you are now able to eliminate that confounding variable, and what happens? The effect of IV on DV will appear. Okay? So that should be your response. You need to make sure that your participants are exerting normal effort to get rid of that confounding variable, and the effect of IV on DV will appear. Question is how? How do you do that? We need to understand first, why did your participants exerted more effort in the first place? The answer, because you revealed to them the true nature of your experiment. Sinabi mo kasi sa kanila kung tungkol saan yung experiment. And by the time you reveal to them what the experiment is all about, doon na nangyari yung problema. Diba? Doon pa lang sa introducing the experiment, no? When you told them that the experiment is on memory, tendency is, because they know that their memory will be observed, they will exert more effort to memorize the list of words, diba? How can revealing the purpose of the experiment be a problem in social psychology? I hope you remember the concept impression management. Sa impression management, ang nangyayari dyan, by nature, people like to look good, people like to look normal, or even better than normal. One perfect illustration of impression management that this is our tendency is when we know that our pictures will be taken. Halimbawa, meron nag-announce sa classroom. In-announce ng prof mo, okay, before we begin our class, we are going to have a picture taking. What will be the first thing you're going to do when you know that your picture will be taken? Magre-retouch ka, 'di ba? Mag-aayos ka, 'di ba? So, kapag pipicturean ka, yung normal look mo, ayaw mong normal. You would like to look good. You would like to appear better than your normal look. So what do? Retouch. Ayos buhok, tatanggalin mo yung oil sa mukha mo, 'di ba? Maglalagay ka ng powder so that when somebody takes your photo, you are going to look better than normal. 'Di ba? Aminin niyo na 'yan. Lahat kayo ganyan ang gagawin when you know that your photo will be taken, because that's human nature. People would like to look good to others. People would like to appear normal or even better than normal when they know that they are being observed by other people, 'di ba? So yun na nga, in-illustrate ko na, no, that this happens when we know that our picture will be taken, or basically when we know that our other people will be watching us. Now, you apply that concept, impression management in experiment, yun yung nangyari. When you told your participants that this experiment will test your memory, anong nangyari? Aba, they would like to impress the experimenter. They would like to make sure that their memory will appear normal or even better than normal. And how can they do that? By doing their best, by exerting more effort in memorizing the list of words that they have, para hindi sila mapaya sa experimenter, para ma-impress yung experimenter. They exerted more effort in memorizing the list of words. That's what we call demand characteristics, okay? When your participants distort their performance in the laboratory to appear normal or better than normal. And when does this happen? When you reveal to your participants the true nature of the experiment. This experiment is on memory. They know that their memory will be observed, so they will exert more effort to make their memory appear normal or better than normal. So what's the solution? Ano ang mga pwede nating gawin para hindi magkaroon ng demand characteristics yung mga subjects natin, so that they will not distort their performance in our experiment? I can have 3 possible solutions here. Okay, number 1. You can reveal to them the true nature of the experiment, but encourage them that they should just act normal. Pwedeng ganun. Reveal mo, this experiment is on memory, pero okay lang po ba na wag nyo po masyadong galingan? Kung normal lang po, kung paano nyo po gawin yung pag-memorize in the outside world, sana po ganun din kayo dito sa laboratory. But to tell you honestly, solution number 1 rarely works. It rarely works because it's like this, no? Don't think of a pink elephant, so you think of a pink elephant, diba? So ganun din dito, no? The more you encourage them to act normal, the more they will not act normal. So solution number 1 rarely works. Maybe you can do solution number 2. Delay reporting the nature of the experiment. So wag mo munang sabihin sa kanila what the experiment is about. Reveal to them later on so that they will act normal in your experiment. Pero ang problema dito, you are going to violate the informed consent. Remember, in the informed consent, they should understand everything in the experiment. And one of those things that they should understand or they should know is what the experiment is about. Okay, so ayaw natin mag-violate ka ng informed consent. Another disadvantage of the solution is it's very demotivating for participants to continue in your experiment. Diba? Halimbawa, yung knowledge peel experiment ko. binigyan mo ng pill yung isang tao doon sa treatment group, diba? Syempre, that person will be dying to know what the pill is all about. Diba? You cannot just say doon sa participant na, oh, inumin mo yung pill. Ang susunod na tatanong niya sa'yo is, bakit? Para saan ba to? Oh, anong pwede mong sagot? Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na, basta inumin mo na lang, mamaya sasabihin ko. Diba? I mean, nakakatakot yun, diba? Your participants will be demotivated to take the pill. Ano muna to? Tell me, ano muna to bago ko to inumin? You see? That's why solution number 2 is rarely used by experimenters. Ang ginagawa talaga to solve demand characteristics is solution number 3. You can just invent the nature of the experiment. In some textbooks, tinatawag itong cover story. Iibahin mo yung cover story mo. Instead of saying that the experiment is about memory, you are going to say that the experiment is about personality. So that's your cover story. You are going to cover the truth, what the experiment is about. So ito na yung tinatawag nating deception. 'Di ba? Sometimes in experiments, kinakailangan mo talagang mag-deceive. Hindi mo kinakailangan mo talagang hindi sabihin yung totoo sa isang experiment to protect your data from confounding variables. But remember, let me just remind you that when you use deception in an experiment, later on during the briefing, you are going to reveal to them your deception. You explain to them why did you need to do that. Kinakailangan maintindihan ng participants mo why did you need to deceive them in the first place. Bakit kinakailangan mo pang sabihin na yung experiment is on personality where the experiment is all about memory, para maintindihan nila why was it necessary for you to do that. Okay? And again, you do that in the briefing. So, yan, dapat ganyan yung nangyari. Introduce the experiment with the cover story. This experiment is on personality, but remember, this is really on memory. And then apply the manipulation, and then measure the dependent variable, and then debriefing. One historical experiment that applied deception or using a cover story was the experiment done by Stanley Milgram on his experiment on obedience. Okay, so if you don't know Stanley Milgram, dapat kilala mo yan. That's one of the most popular experiments in experimental psychology. You watch a video on how the experiment went. But just to demonstrate how cover story was created or was done in this experiment, the experiment was really on obedience. Obedience to authority. Diba? Yun yung gustong pag-aralan ni Milgram. To what extent would people follow an authority even if what the authority is saying to the participants is something bad to do, such as in the experiment electrocuting someone in the laboratory. Hanggang saan sila susunod? So it was about obedience, but in the cover story of Stanley Milgram, before the experiment started, the participants were told that the experiment was really about on learning. Okay? So, yun yung cover story nila. In this experiment, we are observing how the learning process happens between the teacher and the student. Pero sa totoo lang, ang tinitingnan nila is how far will you go in obeying the authority, in when the authority tells you to do something that will hurt another person in the laboratory. Panoorin nyo tong video na to, ha. Oo, sa YouTube. Very interesting experiment. Okay, so that's all about demand characteristics. Now let's move on to the second confounding variable that may be coming from the experimenter. It is called experimenter effect, or in some textbooks, experimenter bias. A drug psychologist was able to come up with a pill that advances one's linguistic skills. So, pampagaling ito ng language. Someone will just take the pill, then big improvements in one's linguistic skills will be observed after a day. A drug manufacturer one day contacted the drug psychologist. They are willing to buy the drug formula from him worth, guess how much? 300 million pesos. But before they buy the formula, the manufacturer demanded that the drug psychologist perform an experiment to really make sure, to really prove that the pill indeed works. So design how the experiment will run, show to the person that you are talking with, again, usually kasi ginagawa ko itong synth work, show to the person you're talking with where experimental effect can be a problem and what can you do to avoid this. So pag-usapan natin paano nakakasama yung experimental effect. Let me present to you before we go back to this case, no? Again, a very popular experiment done during the 1940s. So this was a classic study on the mace doll and the mace bright rats. So ganito nangyari sa experiment na yan, no? In that experiment, they observed the performances of two breed of rats. We have the mace doll rats and the mace bright rats. In the mace doll rats, ang ginawa dito, kaya sila mace doll, these were rats who were not performing so well in mazes in the laboratory. Okay? So, nangolekta sila ng mga rats na hindi magaling in solving mazes. That's why they were called dull. Their intellectual level is very low. And then what they did was, after they collected these rats, worst performing rats in a maze, brinid sila for 4 generations just to make sure that the dullness of these rats are carried over to the next generation. So that means the generation being formed in this experiment, the dullness can be explained by genetic background. They are dull because they are genetically dull. All right. In the maze bright rats, basically they did the same thing. It's just that the rats were bright. And how did they know if the rats were bright? Based on their performance in mazes inside the laboratory. So these were the rats who were performing so well. And they did the same. After they collected these rats, they bred them in 4 generations. So the brightness of the rats in this group are also actually genetics. Okay? So genetically, they are bright. In the other group, genetically, they are dull. So what happened here? In the next phase of the experiment, ang ginawa, they recruited 2 psychologists. Let's call them psychologist A and psychologist B. The maze doll rats were assigned to psychologist B. Sinabihan si psychologist B na I would like you to run a series of tests on these rats in the laboratory and confirm that they are really bright rats. So you see here, he was made to believe that the rats that he was taking care of were bright rats. Pero sa totoo lang, he was taking care of dull rats. The same thing with psychologist A. He was made to believe that he was taking care of dull rats, even if in reality he was taking care of bright rats. Nakuha nyo? Okay. So ano nangyari? After 3 months of evaluating the rats, tinanong yung mga psychologists kung na-confirm ba na yung rats nila was dull or yung rats ba nila were really bright. And surprisingly, ano ang result? Ito ang result. For psychologist A, according to him, his study confirms after a series of tests that the rats that he was taking care of were really dull. Ganon din si psychologist B. Sabi niya, after running series of tests, it confirms that the rats that I'm taking care of were really bright. I want you to notice something here. Anong nangyari dito? Very clearly, psychologists saw what they expected. Nakita nila sa result yung ine-expect nila. So, their expectation distorted the results. Their expectation caused them to conclude something that is not correct. Remember, for psychologist A, ang alaga niya talaga, objectively, mga bright rats, but his expectation distorted that reality. The same thing with psychologist B. He was taking care of dull rats, but his expectation that these rats were bright distorted the reality that he was taking care of bright rats. I mean, he was taking care of dull rats talaga, Anyway, they saw what they expected. Nakikita mo ang gusto mong makita. That can happen in an experiment. When you are expecting something to see in your experiment, most likely that's the conclusion that you are going to end up with. Now, interestingly, this kind of phenomenon in experiments can also happen in human beings. Yung original study ng maze dull rats sa maze bright rats were also replicated in humans. So of course, with a little bit of change in the procedures, It was done by Rosenthal and Jacobson 1968. So teacher A were given dull students, quote unquote, dull students, quote unquote. You should not use the word dull in human beings, even if the students are really bright, while teacher B were assigned bright students, even if the students were really low performing students. Alright? So, ganun din yung ginawa. For teacher A, matatalino naman talaga yung mga estudyante, but he was made to believe they're not. Teacher B, ang nakalagay dito, ang teacher B, he was taking care of not so bright students, but he was made to believe that he was taking care of bright students. So ganun din yung nangyari. After the semester, the teacher confirmed that the students were low in performance, while teacher B, after the semester, confirmed that the students were really bright. So their expectation of their students reflected what they saw from the students. In fact, this study became the basis for what we know today as the Pygmalion effect. You see from a person what you expect from a person, even if the person is not really like that. Hindi naman talaga matatalino yung mga estudyante na ito But since you expected them to be smart, they end up being smart in your eyes. Mga low performing naman talaga yung mga students, Oo. Pero bakit lumabas na matalino sila sa pananaw mo? Because you expected them to be smart and vice versa. 'Di ba? Hindi naman talaga matatalino yung mga estudyante. Or matatalino naman pala yung mga talaga estudyante. Pero sa pananaw mo, sa evaluation mo, hindi sila matalino. Bakit? Because that's what you were made to believe. That's what you expected. That's what we mean by experimenter effect or experimenter bias. We no longer know whether the conclusion that you have in an experiment was caused by your bias or your expectation. Hindi na natin sigurado if the effect that we are seeing in your dependent variable was caused by the IV or was it because you were just biased in that experiment, di ba? Going back to this case that we were working on, nasaan yung posibleng experimenter effect dito? Halimbawa, take a look at this. Ito yung let's run the experiment this way, we have 20 subjects with low linguistic skills, and then let's assign them to 2 levels. Let's say 10 people will take the language pill, another 10 will take the no pill. Okay, so nakontrol na natin yung variable dito. Our control variable here is their linguistic skill. So may eliminate natin yung confounding variable na yon later on sa linguistic skill difference, So we were able to eliminate that. What happens then? Let's go inside the take pill group. Ito yung mangyayari in that group. Let's introduce the experiment. Now, let's use deception to avoid demand characteristics. Okay? So, instead of saying that the experiment is about language, tell them something else, that the experiment is about stress, for example. And then, they will take the pill. 10 of them will take the pill. Let's wait for a day. and then they will deliver a speech, and then it will be scored. Paano yung scoring dito? They will deliver a speech, and then the experimenter will be evaluating how good they are in delivering a speech. Let's say meron tayong gagamitin na instrument. That instrument will help the experimenter find out how they are doing in the speech. That's how we are going to measure the dependent variable. And then after that, of course, they will undergo debriefing. You reveal to them the true nature of the experiment, and you explain to them why it was necessary to deceive them. Maliwanag ba? Alright. In the no-pill condition, tulad nga na sinabi ko, dapat parehong-pareho lang yung nangyari, except for this group, they did not take any pill before doing the speech. But the way we measure the dependent variable is the same. The experimenter will sit down, will listen to their speech, and then will score how well they are doing in delivering a speech, and then they are going to be debriefed. Here's the catch. Remember that you are the experimenter in this study. Ikaw yung nag-i-evaluate. Diba? Ikaw yung nakikinig ng speech nila, ikaw yung nag-i-evaluate. And again, since you are the experimenter here, you know if this person delivering a speech belongs to the treatment group or belongs to the control group. Alam mo kung kumuha siya ng pill, alam mo kung hindi siya kumuha ng pill. Now, look at this. Would you be surprised if in your conclusion, you will say that pill takers have higher linguistic skills? Would you be surprised? Ako hindi. Because ang confounding variable dito is your bias. Let's say yung result lumabas, mas mataas nga yung scores ng mga kumuha ng pill compared to those people who did not take the pill. There is a tendency that you were biased in the first place to say that those people who took the pill were better in delivering speeches compared to those people who did not take the pill. Question: why would you expect pill takers to be better than the non-pill takers? Because a large sum of money is at stake. Diba? 300 million pesos. Kapag napatunayan mo na effective talaga yung pill mo, you will be guaranteed with 300 million pesos. Eh malamang, gugustuhin mo talaga na yung mga pill takers mas magaling sa speech compared sa mga non-pill takers kasi 300 million pesos yun. You see? Now we are no longer sure if that effect that we are seeing in our dependent variable was caused by the language pill or by your bias. So what we need to do is to eliminate that bias that's coming from the experimenter. So how are we going to do that? Okay, unang pwede mong gawin dyan, at sa tingin ko ito naman talaga yung dapat na ginawa, get outside raters. Hanap ka ng mga other experimenters na mag-i-evaluate doon sa participants mo. Hindi dapat ikaw to avoid yourself from being biased. Pero ang disadvantage kasi nito, if you're going to hire outside raters is, i-schedule mo pa yan, babayaran mo pa sila. So the question is there any other way for you to get rid of outside raters? Gusto mo ikaw pa rin yung magre-rate, pero ma-eliminate mo yung experimenter effect. Meron pa rin yan. Number 2, you can apply single blind strategy. In single blind strategy, ang ginagawa dito, the experimenter will not know whether the participant delivering the speech is coming from the treatment group or coming from the control group. So the experimenter here is blind from the grouping of the participants. So tuwing meron nagde-deliver ng speech sa harap niya, hindi niya alam kung yung nagde-deliver ba ng speech is coming from the treatment group or coming from the control group. So how would you do that? You will hire one person who will do something so simple. Ang gagawin lang ng taong yun is ira-random assignment niya yung participants between no pill taking group and the pill taking group. 'Di ba? Siya yung magra-random assignment. The thing is, bakit siya yung gagawa? Para nga hindi mo malaman. So that you will be blinded from the groupings of the participants. So you wouldn't know if someone is from the treatment group or the control group. You ask another person to do that for you. So by the time that a person is in front of you, he or she is delivering a speech, you wouldn't know if that person took the pill or did not take the pill. So in that case, mawawala ngayon yung bias mo, di ba? So again, tuwing merong, parang ganito, look at my illustration, parang ganyan, So merong nagsasalita, nagde-deliver ng speech, ini-scorean mo yung speech niya, pero hindi mo alam if that person talking is a pill-taking person or a non-pill-taking person. 'Di ba? Pero alam niyo, meron pa itong mas magandang approach, no? And I would recommend that you do this. You hire outside experimenters kung meron ka rin namang budget, no? And then, yung outside experimenters mo, hindi rin nila alam if the person that they are evaluating is someone who took the pill or someone who did not. Talagang ma-eliminate mo yung any form of bias in doing that step. Number 3, ito yung pinaka-ginagamit talaga in most experiments, double-blind strategy. Kasi doon sa previous ko, single blind lang di ba? Dito double blind, dalawa ang bulag. So bakit naging double-blind strategy? Okay, the first blind is the experimenter does not know the grouping. So he or she doesn't know if the person delivering a speech is someone from the treatment group or someone from the control group. The second blind here is the participants. The participants don't know the nature of the experiment. So i-apply mo rin yung deception dito, or they don't know if they are in the treatment group or they are in the control group. Nagigets nyo? So, hindi obvious sa participants kung treatment group ba sila or control group ba sila. Basta alam nila merong experiment about something. But they wouldn't know that there is another group. They wouldn't know that they belong to one group different from another group. Hindi mo rin i-reveal na merong treatment group, merong control group. This time, when you do that, you are now dealing with demand characteristics. So, I hope nakita nyo kung bakit siya double blind. We are hitting two birds with one stone. We are getting rid of experimenter effect, at the same time getting rid of demand characteristics. Okay? So, just to illustrate the double blind, ito yung picture dyan. Madalas kasi yung double blind ginagamit yan sa medical researches, no? Pero pwede mo ring i-apply yung concept, yung idea in experimental psychology. But then again, in double blind, dalawa ang bulag. The experimenter is blind from the groupings of the subjects. The subjects are blind from the true nature or from the structure of the experiment. Okay? So, yan yung nangyayari, no? So, the participants this time, they don't know whether they are in a treatment group or in a control group. The experimenter in the same way does not know if that participant he is dealing with is coming from the treatment group or the control group. Okay, so again, you can also apply a variant where you are going to use outside experimenter. Although sa tingin ko naman kapag double blind, okay na yan yung ikaw na rin mismo yung mag-i-evaluate. Pero kung talagang may budget ka naman at gusto mong masigurado na wala kang bias, outside experimenters and then double blind. Maliwanag ba? Actually, itong double blind strategy na ito, tulad nga na sinabi ko kanina, this is being used in a lot of drug research, especially in the development of vaccines. Diba? So let's talk about how vaccines are developed using double-blind studies. Diba? Ano yung mga blind na dapat mangyari when you are trying to develop a vaccine against COVID? Number 1, the Pfizer scientist must not know the groupings of the participants. Hindi nila dapat alam kung sino yung tinurukan ng vaccine, sino yung hindi tinurukan ng vaccine. And sa tingin ko, dapat in this study, the scientist evaluating the participants in this study must be third party. Sorry, no, typo error lang yan. Dapat yan third party evaluators. Ibig sabihin, it's not someone from Pfizer. Independent scientist outside Pfizer ang gagawa ng evaluation of the effect of the vaccine on the participants. And number 2, the participants in these studies must not know if they belong to the treatment group or in the control group or in the placebo group. In most drug research kasi, madalas meron silang placebo, no? In psychology, bihira lang yung may placebo. Just for you to understand, ano ba ibig sabihin ng placebo? Placebo is just like a variant of the control group. So, treatment group is the group that receives the manipulation. Control group is the group that does not receive any manipulation. Yung placebo naman is the group where you are going to give a highly similar manipulation but it's not an effective manipulation. So yung treatment group, tinurukan mo sila ng vaccine na talagang papatay sa COVID. Yung placebo, kunwari ka lang may ituturok. Pero yung ituturok mo, wala talagang epekto sa COVID. See? Yan yung placebo group. What's the purpose of the placebo group? The placebo group is designed so that the effect of the IV on the DV will be very much defined. 'Di ba? IV is effective. Malalaman mo na epektibo talaga yung manipulation sa dependent variable kapag nakita natin from the data that indeed subjects are healthier when they are given the manipulation, which is the vaccine, and they are less healthier if, number 1, they are given something that is not effective, and number 2, they are not given something at all. Mas magiging define yung epekto ng IV sa DV kapag naipakita natin na mas mababa yung dependent variable natin in the control group and in the placebo group. Okay? So again, ginagamit ito madalas sa medical research, no? So if you're going to put that in a diagram, magiging ganyan yan. Hindi alam ng experimenter kung yung sinusuri ba niyang participant is a vaccine person, a placebo person, or a control person. And the participants in this study does not know if they belong to the vaccine group, to the control group, or to the placebo group. Okay? Yan ang maliwanag, no? Sana maliwanag itong sinasabi ko ngayon, no? Anyway, so it's been a long lecture for today. The summary. Confounding variables can come from the experimenter. So yung confounding variables natin can come from the participants themselves, from the environment, pwede rin sa experimenter. And in this lecture video, I discussed the ways on how confounding variables can come from the experimenter, demand characteristic, and experimenter effect. Solution for demand characteristics, cover story. But later on, you reveal to them the true nature of the experiment. Solution for experimenter effect, double blinding. How do you avoid both? Yun na nga, yung double blind strategy. Kasi sa double blind strategy, hitting two birds with one stone. Tanggalin natin yung demand characteristic, tanggalin din natin yung experimenter bias, let's blind both the experimenter and the participants. That's double blinding. So to summarize my lecture videos on part 1 and part 2, ito lahat ng sinabi ko. Confounding variables are not good in psychological experiments. You need to eliminate confounding variables if you want to maintain your internal validity in your experiment. And how can you do that? By working on the sources of those confounding variables. Saan ba nanggagaling yung confounding variables? Unequal group characteristics, environment distractions, demand characteristics, and experimenter effects. Good news! Each of these sources in confounding variables, meron tayong na-identify na mga strategies so that it will not affect our data. We can do random assignment, use laboratory, use cover stories, double blinding, the use of outside raters. All these things can help you eliminate all the confounding variables in your experiment na pwedeng makasira sa internal validity of your conclusion. So I really hope that while you are designing your experiment in your original experiment next year, as you design your experiment, these things must be constantly in your mind. Dapat yung mga strategies nyo, yung mga steps na gagawin nyo in your procedures are able to deal with these potential problems. Dapat mo solusyonan yung mga confounding variables na pwedeng mangyari in running your psychological experiment. So if you have any other questions about our lecture on confounding variables, just feel free to message me through Animospace, or maybe you can comment on the video, on this lecture video that you are watching. Tsaka kung nagustuhan mo tong video na ito, kung maliwanag ba yung pagpapaliwanag ko, paki-like naman yung video para naman ma-feel ko na na-appreciate nyo yung aking malupit na lecture video. Hindi, joke lang. Tama lang, sakto lang yung lecture video ko, no? Anyway, thank you for listening. Let's end it here. I'll see you next time. Thank you and God bless.